we took very aggressive forward-looking because we knew things were going to be unusually difficult. So, of course, this is something we sort of know is coming. We just don't know the size of it. And again, the economy seems to be in solid shape. So the labor market's not crying out for a rate cut. Businesses, were in a bit of shock after April 2, but you see business sentiment, you talk to business people now, there's a very different feeling now that people are working their way through this, and they understand how they're going to go, and it feels much more positive and constructive than it did 3 months ago, let's say. So again, we think that our current stance of monetary policy is in a good place.
Thank you. Amara Mokway with Bloomberg. Chair Powell, in February, you told Congress that the Fed is, quote, overworked, maybe not overstaffed. Then in a memo to staff in May announcing a deferred resignation program at the Fed, you said you wanted to ensure that the Fed was, quote, right-sized. Those two statements appear to be at odds with one another. Could you explain what changed in the roughly 3 months between those statements that made you decide that staff levels at the Fed should decline?
I don't see them at all as intention. So I was asked, is the Fed overstaffed? And I said no. And I sort of said as a pun, overworked but not overstaffed. People do work extremely hard at the Fed, and I know they work hard at Bloomberg too. So, but we do. We work hard. But I would say this. So we are careful stewards of public resources, and sometimes you need to show that. So there have been several times in our history, modern history, where the Fed has said, you know what, we're going to do a buyout. We're going to show the public. We're going to demonstrate that we are good stewards of public resources. So we thought, and I thought, that this is a time when we can, we grow at about, our headcount has grown at about 1% a year. So over the course of a couple of years, we're doing a careful scrub of the board and all the reserve banks, and we're going to find 10% of employees who can do something else, where we can streamline our operations, and we think we can get there in a couple of years. We think we can do that, and we think this is without taking risk to carrying out our critical missions. So this is something you do very carefully, thoughtfully, and you do it, again, respecting that we have critical missions to carry out. I've had experience, a lot of experience in my prior careers, with headcount reductions and things like that, and this is how you do it professionally. You do it carefully, thoughtfully, with a lot of planning, and you do it over a period of time. And I think the Fed will be fine. I think no one will notice any decline in our ability to carry out our missions, and I think it's just us wanting to demonstrate to the public that we are actually good stewards of their resources. We're effectively wiping out 10 years of headcount growth with this. So, I mean, we wanted to show that, that we're good stewards.
How is progress on reducing headcount going so far? Are you on track to meet the goal?
We're just at the very beginning. As you know, we're doing a buyout program. We're gonna hit that goal. I think many organizations find that they can do this. You don't want to do it every year or anything, but you can do it at intervals, and you wind up not interfering with your ability to perform your jobs.
Chair Powell, Claire Jones from the Financial Times. As you're no doubt aware, the Senate Finance Committee has tabled its version of the reconciliation bill this week, and I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about the tenor of the debate at the FOMC over the past few days on fiscal policy and the degree to which that influenced people's projections for 2026 and beyond. Thank you.
Yeah, so we don't sit around and debate or really discuss. We take fiscal policy as fully exogenous, and so we actually really didn't talk about the bill or the contents of it. It's still evolving. When it gets closer, remember also we have a very, very large economy, and that the effects will be at the margin, I expect that they may already be in, but they will be in by the next meeting. We'll make an estimate, but it's not a major thing. It's nothing that we discuss. It may have been mentioned a couple of times, but as something that's coming in. But I think the outcome is, we don't know the outcome yet there, so hard to be real specific.
Neil. Thanks, Chair Powell. Neil Irwin with Axios. There have been some cutbacks in economic statistics collection in the last few weeks, and worries that long-running problems around funding and response rates may be getting worse. How much is this concern on your radar? How much confidence do you have that the gauges you're watching to assess the economy are reliable right now?
You know, two things. One, the data we get right now, we can do our jobs. I'm not concerned that we can't do our jobs. That's not the point. The point really is that we are starting to see, layoffs and important gatherers of data are saying that they're having to cut back on the size of their surveys. That's going to lead to more volatility in the surveys. I think we should take a step back and, from our standpoint, and I think the standpoint of businesses and governments and everyone, having really good data on the state of the economy at any given time is a huge public good. It helps, it not just doesn't help the Fed, it helps the government, it helps Congress, it helps the executive branch. More importantly, really, it helps businesses. They need to know what's going on in the economy. The United States has been a leader for many, many years in this whole project of measuring and understanding what's happening in our very large and dynamic economy. And I hate to see us cutting back on that, because it is a real benefit to the general public that people in all kinds of jobs have the best possible understanding of what's happening in the economy and hence what's likely to happen. It's very hard to measure what's going on in the U.S. economy. If you read, there was a book called, it's really remarkable how many things you need to understand to estimate U.S. GDP. Very, very difficult, and it's so important that we get it right. I just would say it's not a place to I would want to keep investing in that, for the good of the general public.
Victoria. Hi, Victoria Guida with Politico. So you're conducting this monetary policy strategy framework review, but next year we're supposed to have a new Fed chair, and I'm wondering if that affects at all the way that you're approaching this. How do you ensure that this framework will actually be durable?
The framework document goes back to 2012, and it's the committee's document. It's not like we're going to invent a brand new way to do things. It's been an evolving document, so it shouldn't depend on who the chair is at all. It should depend on what's happening in the economy and what the committee wants to do. So, yeah, it isn't really tied to any particular chair. And we used to renew it every year. Now we do it every 5 years. So, but I don't think I've never heard anyone raise this issue that, a new chair might want to come in and go in a completely different direction. I really don't think that's right. But that's not going to be up to me to decide.
Is that affecting at all who you're consulting with?
Not at all. Not in any way.
Thank you. Chair Powell, Matt Egan from CNN. Relatively low gas prices this year have helped drive down inflation in recent reports, but that trend is starting to reverse given the crisis in the Middle East. How are you thinking about how the Israel-Iran conflict will impact the economy, especially inflation, and what lessons were learned during the 2022 period when another conflict, the Russia-Ukraine war, sent oil and gas prices skyrocketing?
So, of course, we're watching, like everybody else is, what's going on. I really don't have any comment on that. Possible that we'll see higher energy prices. What's tended to happen is when there's turmoil in the Middle East, you may see a spike in energy prices, but it tends to come down. Those things don't generally tend to have lasting effects on inflation, although, of course, in the 1970s, they famously did, because you had a series of very, very large shocks. But we haven't seen anything like that now. The U.S. economy is far less dependent on foreign oil than it was back in the 1970s. So, but there.
A quick follow-up. I've just got to ask you about artificial intelligence. Some technology executives have recently been warning that AI could wipe out a large chunk of entry-level jobs and significantly increase the unemployment rate. I'm wondering how concerned you are, if at all, about the threat that AI poses to employment.
So this is the question. The question really is, will AI be more augmenting labor or replacing labor? And I wouldn't, we all see those announcements, including one today. I wouldn't, overread a couple of data points because, AI should be creating jobs at the same time. It may be replacing, maybe doing both. Anyone who's done any work with it, with AI, will have been a little bit stunned at how capable it is. And it's just a different thing. So I think this is something that certainly has transformational potential. And probably we're in the very early stages of it. They say what you're seeing now compared to what you'll see in 2 years is going to be very different and even more effective. So I think it's really hard to know. Of course, there are optimists who feel like it's going to make everybody much more productive. And there are those who think it's going to replace an awful lot of jobs right across the income spectrum, white collar, blue collar, and everything. So I just don't know. We don't have a house view on that, but this is going to be a very important question for some time.
Greg.
Thank you. Greg Rapp from MarketWatch. I was wondering if you could step back a little bit, Chair Powell. There's a spate of articles and a lot of op-eds now in the newspapers saying that the U.S. economy and the global economy is going through this profound change, akin to the end of the Bretton Woods era in the 1970s. And don't you owe the American people some sort of explanation for what we're going through? I mean, I noticed earlier this month when you talked about Bretton Woods a little bit, and you said that Bretton Woods, the Fed staff had to change how the dollar, movements of the dollar was impacting the economy. Are we going through something like that now? That, are you having to change how you do monetary policy? Is it that fundamental a change underway? Thanks.
It's certainly a time of real change. From a geopolitical standpoint, from a trade standpoint, from an immigration standpoint, you see this not just here but everywhere. So there's quite a lot going on. It doesn't change the way we do monetary policy in the near term. And it doesn't change our objectives or what we need to do. And these things are not really our issues. They're really issues for elected governments. All of those issues are really for elected governments. But there's no question it's a time of real change, and very hard to see where that goes. Will it be? There have been many things written about how it's going to be a more inflationary time. That's possible. It's not guaranteed. AI could cut in the very other direction. AI could make people much more productive and push in the other direction. I don't know, though. So, but you're right. But honestly, our focus is a much more practical one, and that is how do we keep inflation low and employment high in the near term. That's really what we're about.
Mark Hamrick.
Hello, Chairman Powell. Mark Hamrick with Bankrate. What is the view about the growing amount of slack in the job market, including the softening in payrolls, the forecast of a modest rise in the unemployment rate, and the ability of workers to demand wage hikes or not in this environment where you have inflation surging?
You don't really see unemployment going up. You don't see increased slack, really. At the margin, remember, you're at 4.2% unemployment. That was, for many years, that was an extremely low level. It happens to have come up off of an even lower level as we came out of the pandemic. We were as low as 3.4%, but 4.2% is probably at the low end of estimates of the longer run, sustainable level of natural rate of unemployment. So I guess I wouldn't agree with that. And also, in terms of wages, real wages after inflation have been moving up sort of more than was consistent with 2% inflation. They're still moving up at a healthy clip, and I think much more consistent with 2% inflation given a reasonable assessment of trend productivity. So it's a pretty good labor market. You're right that the level of job creation has come down, but so has the supply of workers, the change in the supply, the new supply. So you've seen the unemployment rate remain pretty stable at 4.2. It's been as high as 4.3, but those are good numbers. So it's a pretty good labor market. There's a more concerning thing is there are not a lot of layoffs, but there are not a lot of job creation. If you're out of work, it's hard to find a job. But very few people are being laid off at this point. So that's an equilibrium we watch very, very carefully, because if there were to be significant layoffs and the job finding rate were to remain this low, you would have an increase in unemployment fairly quickly. But that hasn't happened. It really hasn't happened. The U.S. economy has defied all kinds of forecasts for it to weaken, really, over the last 3 years. And it's been remarkable to see just again and again when people think it's going to weaken. Now, eventually it will, but we don't see signs of that now.
Go to Jean for the last question.
Hi, Chair Powell. Jean Young with MNI Market News. There's been a lot of talk about cuts. I wanted to ask you, why do you think there are no forecasts for rates to rise or even to stay where they are next year, given that the projection for inflation is to rise to 3%, and there's a lot of there's some skepticism over whether those price hikes will be a one-time event?
So there are a number of people on the committee who wrote down no cuts this year, but some cuts next year. So, I think, people are writing down their most likely path, right? They're not saying there's zero possibility of other things. Really, think of it as the least unlikely path in a situation like this where uncertainty is very high. I think, again, people write down their rate paths, and they do not have like a really high conviction that this is exactly what's going to happen over the next 2 years. No one feels that way about their rate path. They feel like, what am I going to write down? I mean, what would you write down? It's not easy to do that with confidence. So I would just say it that way. We don't rule things in or out. Certainly a hike is not the base case at all. It's not something people are writing down. But in the meantime, we do the best we can with these forecasts, and I think they're representative of the different forecasts and different reaction functions that people on the committee have. So thank you very much. Thanks.
This is The Fed Decides on Bloomberg Television and Radio. That was Fed Chair Jerome Powell at the press conference following the central bank's decision to keep rates unchanged. What would you write down? I don't know. What would you write down? What about those dots? This is a Fed that sees a lot more certainty ahead, but not yet enough to make any moves. While Powell said that peak uncertainty happened in April, and we are getting some clarity, there's still a lot to learn until the data becomes clear. They're on hold and are in a good place. Take a listen.
We feel like the right thing to do is to be where we are, where our policy stance is, and just learn more. And in particular, we feel like we're going to learn a great deal more over the summer on tariffs. We hadn't expected them to show up much by now, and they haven't. And we will see to the extent to which they do over coming months. And I think that's going to inform our thinking.
Jerome Powell also asked about the situation in the White House, dismissing questions around the future for him on the Federal Reserve.
I need to ask, assuming you are not reappointed, would you stay on as governor when your term as chair ends?
I'm not thinking about that. I'm thinking about this.
Is a retracement of some of the earlier moves. We are seeing bond yields actually climb back to basically where they were and then some from before the press conference. Tom, it seemed like this was a Fed chair saying that we are past peak uncertainty, but we probably will get more information later, so stop asking.
It's true, the press conference, looking at the correlation of equities, bonds, currencies, commodities, was sort of up and downy and up and downy. And I didn't get any real conviction out of it. The one tone I saw from him that I hear in some conversations is, what if we're underestimating the power of this American economy? There's a gloomy call. The GDP numbers come down. Inflation's up. Woe is me. But, and that but was just there for a bit where he said, you know what? It is a resilient economy.
You have said the phrase that I think about all the time, which is that companies adapt and adjust. And we hear that from so many companies that are doubling down on some of their forecasts.
Particularly around tariffs.
Yes, exactly, because they have to look past that and they can handle some of these tariffs. What I thought was interesting was that this was a Fed chair that actually said if we were backward looking at the data, we probably would be cutting more quickly. But because of the tariffs and the forward expectation for more inflation, it does create a greater degree of uncertainty, which is the reason why we still are happy to stand tight.
You don't see this, folks, but Lisa, during the press conference, she's got one of those little clips clicker things like in a movie theater, and every time they say uncertainty, you're moving your thumb around. And there was
And you're drinking.
150, well, it's surveillance beverage time. The issue here, Lisa, is the uncertainty issue was given to them. They didn't invent it. The president's comments today, outrageous comments. Do you see what he did to McKee? He slammed Michael McKee after those rude McKee-like questions. Tariffs, Bob Michael saying, do we know what tariffs will raise? We have no clue what they will raise.
Which is the reason why they aren't necessarily going to make any big moves right now. Joining us now is Stephanie Roth of Wolfe Research. So pleased to say that you're here in studio. Stephanie, what was your take on a press conference where this Fed chair said that he had more certainty, but there'll be more later on?
I think the single most important line that he said is rates aren't very high. And when we're thinking about the next couple of months, what we're going to learn is more information about the reconciliation bill. So then they're going to incorporate that fully into the SEP, in which case that's going to look a lot more hawkish. So our base case is this year, they're not cutting. And the two cuts are going to eventually get sort of rolled away. At this point, they were very close on the edge of between 1 and 2, and they're probably going to eventually not end up cutting this year because the economy will be resilient and fine, and inflation's elevated.
On the core GDP equation, do you have any conviction at all in C, I, G, or NX? I mean, I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you come up with a real GDP statistic.
Yeah, we're looking for 1.4% GDP this year, so not that different from the Fed. But I think the important thing to focus on is for 2026, my forecasts are a lot higher than what the Fed has. I'm looking for something that's close to 2%, if not a bit above. Our forecast is that reconciliation bill could boost the economy by about 40 basis points. So that could be a notable acceleration versus where we are today. And that's what the market's going to start focusing on.
Lisa, help me. Is the reconciliation bill the big, beautiful thing?
It's one big, beautiful B.
Okay.
It's one 3B. Yes, we can.
Again, more uncertainty.
Well, that's the problem. And I really was struck by the idea that Fed Chair Powell brought to the fore, which is in response to Nick Timiraos of the Wall Street Journal's question, why aren't you looking at some of the weakening trend that we're seeing in inflation and say, you know what, we're actually quite restrictive. Why are you saying that this is actually an appropriate rate? And the Fed chair said, well, the reason why is because we have to look forward and we have to say this could potentially be inflationary and we don't know, and we will learn more in the next couple of months, but we're not sure how much we're going to learn. Is that good enough for you? Does that ring true to you that that is an appropriate stance for this Fed?
I think it's fair for them to be in wait and see. They know that the tariffs will be inflationary. He very much emphasized someone's going to be paying the cost, and eventually they're going to try to get it to the consumer. And I think that's the right way to think about it. It's going to eventually flow through some portion of it to the consumer. Our numbers are similar to the Fed's forecast that inflation should be close to 3% at the end of this year. And at this point, we don't know how much. It's hard to forecast these things, but I think the main takeaway is inflation will be elevated this year, but growth should probably hold up just fine.
Which is essentially what they were saying, albeit at a slower pace. Right now, we're so lucky to have Torsten Slok of Apollo joining us. Torsten, thank you so much for being here. What was your take on the press conference, on the Fed stance, and frankly, the market taking this based in stride, not saying that they're getting much new information here?
I think the banner hanging over this entire press conference and the forecast is stagflation. They revised down GDP growth to 1.4 and they revised up inflation to 3%. That's telling you that they are beginning to worry about the things that are hitting the U.S. economy, and it's no longer just trade and tariffs that's stagflationary. Oil prices are also stagflationary, meaning higher inflation, lower GDP growth. And restrictions on immigration is also stagflationary. We already saw in the last employment report upward pressure on wages, and of course that ultimately means downward pressure on employment if we're going to do, in particular, deportations at the current pace. So the conclusion is, it is not surprising that the Fed is beginning to worry about their mandate being torn in the opposite direction, because inflation higher says that you'd be hiking. GDP growth lower says that you'd be cutting. So that's why, at the moment, they stay put. And the conclusion, therefore, is that he didn't really give much other than say, we will likely be cutting, and that's what's in their dot plot. But the conclusion is, this is a very difficult situation for them when there's both, as he said, meaningful expectations of upward pressure on inflation and at the same time a revision down in GDP growth.
Torsten, he alluded to a data capture, which is perhaps showing a more resilient GDP, a better, stronger America. Steve Raschuta at Mizuho is heated about this, that we could see GDP better. Is that in any probability for you?
Well, I think that when it comes to a particular trade, forgive the picture here, but the pig is coming through the python. Someone needs to pay for the tax increase on imports. Tariffs have gone up, and if companies are not passing this on to consumers, let's say that inflation does not go up as much as we would have expected, then the conclusion is, well, then earnings will simply be going down more, because this tax increase means, of course, that you will begin to see some downward pressure on GDP and potentially some more downward pressure on earnings. So that's another way of saying we saw effective tariff rates go up from 3% in January to now 18% today, and that effect will still be playing out. And he said very clearly he does expect a meaningful increase in inflation over the coming months. So combining that with, he said, we could also see a cooling down in the labor market. It does mean that just maybe inflation will not go up so much, but the consequence of that will be, well, then we will instead see tariffs coming through instead through lower GDP growth and a bigger hit to earnings.
And he expects to see some data on that front in the upcoming months. Right now, let's bring back in Bloomberg's Michael McKee. If you are just joining us, we did just conclude the Fed's press conference where, Mike, you put him on the spot there with the political question. I don't know that he loved answering it. We were all glad that you asked it. What was your takeaway from the press conference in terms of what you felt was the most new information that we gleaned?
Well, I think the takeaway is fairly obvious here, and I'm not sure that my economist friends all agree with me, but I think the line that you want to look at is how many times Jay Powell said nobody on the committee has a lot of conviction about these forecasts. In other words, this is all going to change, and we had to write down something, so we did. So don't take us seriously in terms of the number of rate cuts. Don't take us seriously in terms of the forecast. It's the best we can do at the moment, but we know this is all going to be different. So don't, I would translate that into don't invest on the idea that the Fed is going to be doing 2 rate cuts by the end of the year.
Michael McKee, thank you so much for being with us. And Stephanie, we were kind of laughing around the table when he said, we just kind of turned to each other and say, what did you write down? You know, I don't know. I'm kind of throwing a dart at the dartboard, but it does feel like they are trying to message something to markets. And do you think that this is saying, ultimately, we understand our dual mandate and we are going to respond potentially to a weaker jobs picture?
I think it's saying there are risks to both sides of our mandate. We don't know if it's going to be on the inflation or the growth side. And at this point, we're in wait and see mode. I think the ultimate destination will be that the economy holds up okay. Inflation does pick up. I totally agree with Torsten's comments. If it doesn't pick up, that's almost a bad sign because that's going to come from company margins. But at the end of the day, we'll come through this okay, and then the focus will be on 2026 for markets, which is an economy that's just fine.
Your core ability is the math and the dynamics of our math. The toughest math is productivity. Is productivity still in play? Is there a total factor productivity right now that we underestimate?
Yeah, I think that's certainly the case, and hopefully it's the case, especially given that our labor supply is shrinking, so we kind of need that to some extent. And our base case is that the productivity should be fairly solid throughout the course of this year into next year. It is hard to estimate. But I do think AI is going to slowly have that impact over the course of the next couple of years.
With productivity gains, Torsten, and I'd love you to weigh in on this because you've been really good on this. We're not necessarily going to get recession. A lot of people say that's not their base case, but we are going to get a slowdown at a time of increasing inflation. People seem to think if there's a recession, that's really bad. If there's not a recession, that's really good. What is that breaking point where you have growth slowing enough that it becomes really terrible for companies in terms of where inflation is and growth just not keeping up?
The talk of war, Lisa, at the moment, namely, we do have a number of things that are weighing on growth, as we're talking about here, namely higher oil prices, higher tariffs. We now also have restrictions on immigration, meaning removing labor. All those things would argue for GDP growth slowing down, as the consensus expects over the coming quarters. But at the other end of the rope in this talk of war, we have definitely the productivity increases that we potentially could see. He did respond to the question around, will this be labor replacing or labor augmenting? And we still just really don't know the answer to that question. Yes, it is the case in the census surveys when businesses are asked, have you adopted AI in the last 2 weeks, that about 10% of companies and a rising share is saying, yes, we are now using today AI tools to improve our productivity. But the speed with which productivity gains, and to Tom's point, total factor productivity, namely how well labor and capital work together, the speed with which we'll see that in the data is probably going to take quite a bit longer. So I worry more about the cyclical downward pull on GDP growth. Because I do think that over time we will see the AI gains, but it's just probably not going to come quick enough relative to some of the downward pull coming from the cyclical forces of tariffs, higher oil prices, and at the same time also the restrictions on immigrations we're seeing.
Given that backdrop, Torsten, do you think that based on what this Fed said, they are just moderately restrictive? Do you think they're more restrictive than that? Or do you think that this really is closer to neutral than many people think?
Well, that's why this discussion, Lisa, around, as we have all talked about for so many years now, our star and where are we relative to that. Note how he didn't bring that up today. This conversation about where are we relative to neutral has almost become a backseat issue because now there are some cyclical issues that are overwhelming the structural discussion around where neutral rates are. So, but I do think that the Fed's own framework and the New York Fed's estimates would certainly say that neutral is lower. And as he did hint a little bit at, that we are in slightly restrictive territory. But the issue still here is they are battling. The major issue is that, as he said, they expect to see meaningful upside pressure on inflation. And that makes sense, not only headline inflation because of oil prices, but also because of tariffs. And again, because of the emerging pressure we're seeing on wages. So the short answer to your question is, I think that this discussion of restrictive or not restrictive is taking a little bit of a backseat because we now have some cyclical forces pushing inflation up over the coming months.
Torsten Slok of Apollo, thank you so much for being with us and for those comments. Joining us now is Subhadra Rajappa of SocGen. Just curious, Subhadra, what you make of this idea that rates are not very high, that policy is modestly